Russia is blessed with being the world's largest holder of proven reserves of natural gas, and it's a commodity that has multiple uses, from fueling vehicles to heating homes. But why then is this sought-after asset becoming a political battleground? Well, the Russians have been fueling Europe with liquefied natural gas for some time, and the creation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was supposed to bring in more LNG to Europe, but the U.S. has put a hold on things for now in the form of sanctions.
То есть фактически американцы могут сегодня использовать свои, если они завтра отсекут как бы российский газ или уменьшат долю российских поставок, они получат мощный рычаг геополитического давления. Это не просто то, что они могут, скажем, продавать свой газ.
With only 160 kilometers left of the pipeline to be completed, well, the U.S. has targeted this pipe-laying vessel, as well as threatening the Swiss company in charge of engineering the project. But not all parties are happy with the notion of slapping sanctions on projects like Nord Stream.
Gewärtigen und ich sehe auch keine andere Möglichkeit, als Gespräche zu führen, aber sehr entschiedene Gespräche, dass wir diese Praxis nicht billigen, dass diese exterritorialen Sanktionen wirken. Und jetzt werden wir sehen.
Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavit Afai. In this week's episode of the show, we'll be looking at how the U.S. and Russia are competing against each other to obtain a significant slice of the European gas market. Now, don't forget that we would like to hear your thoughts about this or any other subject that you want to share with us, so don't forget to check out our Twitter page using the marker @ED_program, where you can share a post or write a message. We would love to hear from you. Well, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is the second such line to traverse between Russia and Europe, leaving the port of USC Luga near St. Petersburg, tunneling under the Baltic Sea, and arriving in Germany at the port of Greifswald, a journey of some 1,200 kilometers. The pipeline, once complete, will have a capacity flow of 55 billion cubic meters per year and will be run by the Russian gas company Gazprom. Along with the existing Nord Stream 1 pipeline, the combined lines will deliver some 110 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe. Now, the funding of the pipeline is a combined project with NG, OMV, Royal Dutch Shell, Uniper, and Wintershall all being involved. The 5 European companies will provide 50% of the total $11 billion cost, with the Swiss firm Allseas laying the pipes.
The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is an ongoing project linking Russian natural gas to Europe and is an extension of the original Nord Stream pipeline that was successfully constructed in 2011. The project, which runs parallel to the original pipe, was intended to bring a further 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year to the European market in order to quench its demands, from home cooking to home heating and beyond. The project is an offshore subsea pipeline running from Ust-Luga near St. Petersburg underneath the Baltic Sea and arriving in the German port town of Greifswald. The pipeline covers around 1,230 kilometers and has cost around $11 billion to build so far. The pipeline was being laid by a Swiss company called Allseas, who specialize in subaquatic pipelines, and until now has completed the majority of the route under the sea, with just around 160 kilometers left of pipe to lay. However, things have come to a grinding halt as the project has come under scrutiny of the US, who have seen 2 senators, Ted Cruz and Jeanne Shaheen, introduce sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, with threats banning employees and their families travelling to the US, something that also has been repeated with the ICC staff for investigating US war crimes in Afghanistan. German Chancellor Angela Merkel was quick to condemn the sanctions imposed on the project, as Russian pipeline vessels have now taken over from the Swiss in order to lay the final few kilometers of the pipeline, hoping to end the project by the end of 2020.
To me, it is a tragedy. I think it's a horrific thing that's being done, where you are feeding billions and billions of dollars from Germany primarily, and other countries, but primarily from Germany, into the coffers of Russia, when we're trying to do something so that we have peace in the world. I think it's a horrible thing that Germany's doing. I think it's a horrible mistake. And as much as I like Angela, I was very open in saying it. I think it's a horrible thing. that you have a pipeline coming from Russia, and I believe that Germany is going to be getting 50, 60, or even I've heard numbers of 70% of their energy coming in from Russia. And how can you be working for peace and working from strength when somebody has that kind of power over your country? I don't think it's good. You're not working from strength. You've given up all of your strength. I think it's very bad for Germany, very bad for the German people, and I don't think it's very good for NATO. You want to know the truth, so.
For Europe, the potential consequences of having the project blocked could not come at a worse time, as their own domestic production of gas is set to fall over the coming years. With extremely cold winters in parts of Europe, the risk of having a much-needed lifeline cut off could come at a grave cost for those who rely on cheap and readily available heating. The fact of the matter is that Europe, as a paying customer, needs to be able to pay for cheap gas and worry a little less about where it comes from, particularly in times of economic hardship.
Состояние, когда ни у кого нет денег. И если Европа была готова платить и 30, даже 70% сверх цены за то, чтобы поддерживать хорошие отношения с Америкой, то через годик у них просто не будет этих.
Why is the EU seeking to import gas from other regions? Well, the simple answer is the EU domestic gas production is set to fall by 50% in the next 20 years, with Norway, the Netherlands, and the UK all greatly reducing their output in the future. Furthermore, the EU is turning to Russian gas as a cheaper and more efficient source, moving away from suppliers in North Africa and the Caspian region, leaving a market gap of some 120 billion cubic meters per year to be filled. The EU is also intent on reducing their carbon footprints, and hence why turning to gas is a cleaner and greener alternative, with Nord Stream 2 gas reducing the total EU carbon emissions by some 14%. Now this equals to around the combined emission of some 30 million cars if gas was to be used instead of coal as a fuel source.
The US has enjoyed a hegemonic grip over the world order since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, which saw the two nations face off for decades in a Cold War that brought with it much tension. The rise of the Russian Federation from the ashes of the Soviet Union initially took time to develop, yet today there's no doubt that Russia are competing once again with the United States as a global world power to be reckoned with. So could the Nord Stream pipeline be a sign that a new war is emerging between the Russians and the Americans? The fact of the matter is, it was only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, started to challenge the hegemonic power of the US. As things stand, there are multiple nations threatening the US position, with the likes of China and India also making strides to make it to the top, in order to stop the Russians gaining access to a huge energy market and hence dampen the effects of a trade war. The stalling tactics used by the US to halt the Russians in the form of sanctions is essentially a use of soft power. But one has to question the legality of the act. Can the US in fact legally block Russians from building the Nord Stream pipeline and hence gain an advantage in this new Cold War?
So the actions in terms of blocking gas would not be legal, but I think what the US is trying to attack is the access to the finance to complete the project and to ensure that that finance isn't available for the project, as well as thinking about some of the environmental aspects which will be associated with getting access to that finance.
What now remains to be seen is whether the actions of the US in attempting to block the Russian sale of gas to Europe becomes a catalyst for a tit-for-tat soft war between the US and Russia, as both start a new path in the Cold War tension between the two countries.
Joining me in the studio today is Christopher Hartwell. He's a professor of financial systems resilience from the University of Bournemouth. He's published extensively on international trade and economic integration, with an emphasis on Eurasian integration and transition dynamics. Professor Hartwell, thanks for joining us here on Economic Divide.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, first up, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a major engineering project that could supply up to 55 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe per year. Why then is the U.S. placing sanctions on this much-needed energy line, do you think?
Well, you have to consider this not only in terms of the economics, but in terms of the geopolitics. And the energy market globally is being utilized as a geopolitical tool. What the United States wants out of this is not necessarily for Europe to become more reliant on Russian gas, on Russian petrochemicals, and they want to be able to also have this alternative of having Europe purchase from U.S. refineries, to purchase from U.S. gas suppliers.
Okay, with the oil prices having crashed earlier this year, I'm sure you know that, what impact is these sanctions are going to have, do you think, on the Russian economy, who are seeking to continue their energy exports during these challenging times?
Well, Russia has said that it wants to go ahead, no matter what, with the completion of Nord Stream 2. And by latest estimates, they're probably about 94% done. There's only small portions outside of Denmark that need to be completed. Russia is, as we know, heavily reliant on oil and gas trade. As former U.S. Senator John McCain said, it's a gas station masquerading as a country. So they are heavily reliant on this, on completing Nord Stream 2. They're heavily reliant on getting their wares to market. So I think they're going to try and go ahead. Whether or not they're actually technically able to, if Gazprom is technically able to continue this, given the sanctions, given the expansion of sanctions, is another question. But I think they're going to try because they need to.
Okay, and when it comes to Europe, I mean, they're the paying customer. Aren't they entitled to choose who their energy supplier is going to be? I mean, Germany has already shown their distaste over the sanctions, naturally. Do you think that this is going to then push the EU closer to Russia?
Well, Germany has always been and always had this kind of strain of anti-Americanism, especially when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to what we call extraterritoriality with U.S. kind of foreign policy. They've pushed back against sanctions on Iran. They've pushed back against sanctions on Russia. German business has been very vocal in wanting to drop the sanctions that accompanied the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass that Russia is waging right now. So in theory, yes, I mean, as a sovereign nation, Germany has its own right to kind of purchase gas from wherever it comes from. But whether or not it's a good idea, I think, is something that the U.S. is concerned with, especially since the U.S. is still fronting the bill for NATO, is still having troops stationed in Germany, and is still really paying for Western European protection from the Russian bear.
Okay, Professor Hartwell from the University of Bournemouth, many thanks for being with us today on Economic Divide.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so that's Professor Bournemouth. Obviously, it's questionable whether these U.S. sanctions are going to stop Russia from completing this. From the sounds of what he said anyways, Russia is very adamant to complete this project. Okay, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, as coming up next, we're going to take a look at how the U.S. is trying to compete with Russia in terms of gas production and ascertain whether fracking for gas is a viable, cheap, and environmentally friendly process. We also will examine what alternative sources of energy Europe may be able to rely on should the Nord Stream 2 pipeline be delayed or canceled, as well as hearing from the Nord Stream 2 project themselves. Also, we'll be looking at some other economic news that have hit the headlines from the front pages around the world in our Info News section. And we will be joined by Atafe Padidar, who will be giving us her views on the topic. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message. Time to take a look at what else is happening in the world of economics with our first story taking us to the UK. Now, the OECD has announced that the British economy will be the hardest hit in Europe with a slump of 11.5%, eclipsing that of mainland European nations like France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The COVID-19 virus has had a larger-than-life impact on the economy of Dubai, as some 900,000 expats could lose their jobs due to the economic downturn and see some 10% of the population leave the emirate, with around 70% of Dubai-based companies expected to go out of business within 6 months. Now, more bad news for U.S. jobs, as the retail industry predicts that some 25,000 stores will be closing down by the end of 2020 in America as the economic fallout of the COVID-19 virus hits the U.S., as second quarter figures emerge showing worse than expected predictions. And finally, the protests in the U.S. that highlight not only police brutality against African Americans, but also bring to light disparities between the wealth of whites and African Americans. Well, there are 3 ways that the tax code in that country amplifies the black-white wealth gap. It cites that many black taxpayers aren't in a financial position to access the tax code's special aspects. Now, this black-white wealth gap will be covered in next week's program at length due to what is happening not only in the U.S. but around the world in terms of social injustice. Please make sure you send us your story wherever you may be so we can highlight news that perhaps is not being covered by the mainstream media. You can get in touch through our Twitter address @ED_program. Let's now take a look at whether fracking and shale gas is a viable option and consider what alternatives Europe has in terms of their energy supplies.
If the US are to try and stop Russia selling their gas to Europe, what is it then they're trying to offer in the place of the Russian product? For a start, the US are reliant on huge reserves of shale gas, an asset that, although vast in quantity, requires the highly controversial process of fracking to obtain the product. Part of the Paris Climate Accord that the US once signed up to was to stop the production of shale gas due to the environmental impact of actually obtaining the gas, and was hence one of the reasons that Trump pulled out of the deal.
The Paris Accord was an agreement that would have shut down clean energy production in America while allowing top foreign polluters to do whatever the hell they wanted. It was a restriction on America. It was almost made to hold us back, and nothing's holding us back.
But fracking and shale gas has several disadvantages when it comes to being the most efficient product for the Europeans to buy. As mentioned earlier, we already know that Russian gas is cheaper, but furthermore, the logistics of the operation is much cheaper, as Russia are able to transfer gas in a non-stop supply through the likes of the Nord Stream pipelines. Furthermore, the uninterrupted supply through the pipelines avoids the need for liquefied natural gas to be transported sporadically in ships from the US to Europe. So the question is, what alternatives do Europe have for importing gas from either Russia or the US? For a start, fracking's out of the question.
We're here to try to show that the people don't want it, that it's not welcome, that it's not democratic, it's been rejected locally, it's overruled by the government, no one wants it here, we want to get rid of it.
Furthermore, there's the pressure of Europe to lead the way in terms of energy use and emissions promises.
The EU must lead the way. You have the moral obligation to do so, and you have a unique economical and political opportunity to become a real climate leader.
So what alternative sources of energy are there for Europe?
Yeah, I think this is the big challenge. I think if this project doesn't go ahead, it really will put the EU under spotlight. Is the EU going to actually deliver on all the promises it has around green energy, or if we think more broadly, low carbon energy? So I think the EU will have to clearly try and achieve its policy, and I don't think there should be any second chances for the EU. The EU has to show global leadership on this issue. Well, I think primarily it has to be solar energy, it has to be wind, and there has to be an element of nuclear energy. But I think more importantly is about building new electricity grids all over Europe that can accommodate this, particularly solar and wind energy. So it's about maximizing the use of the electricity grids, ensuring that electricity grids are increasingly interconnected, but also all across Europe, a lot of the electricity grids need to be updated, and we need those updated fast, so we can capture the benefits of solar, renewable, and also even nuclear energy.
Joining us in the studio is journalist and researcher Atafe Padidar. Atafe, what do you have for us today?
Oh, this is interesting. All the U.S. attempts to stop the Nord Stream project by imposing more sanctions on Russia and threatening the European countries tells us a couple of things. This is not the first time the U.S. tries to force Europe to abandon a deal by pressuring Brussels and sanctioning the other member. The latest in a series of such a strategy has been the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. All these U.S. pressures on the EU challenges the bloc as a unified and strong union. It once again questions the existence of the European Union. Every time the EU tries to make a decision in which the US sees no benefit of its own, Washington meddles in and pressures the bloc to look the other way. Do we need to point out the effects of US-China trade war on Europe's economy? Critics of the bloc say the EU acts like a loose union of nations with minimal political integration. After all, if you can't make a decision on your own, why do you even need a union?
Indeed. Very good point to leave that on. Thank you, Atafe, for your informative report. Great having you with us once again. Let's now see what Nord Stream 2 has to say about the project and the notion of sanctions themselves.
Here at Economic Divide, we contacted the Nord Stream 2 project to ask their views on the US sanctions and asked them to explain how this would affect the European gas supplies. Their official spokesperson, Jens Müller, stated the following.
The proposed additional US sanctions would directly hit dozens of European companies from more than 12 countries. Moreover, these sanctions would not only undermine investments in Nord Stream 2 itself, but also investments in downstream infrastructure in Germany and the Czech Republic, constructed to transport this gas throughout the European market. Finally, it should be noted that these sanctions appear calculated to enhance sales of more expensive US LNG by taking out a potential competitor. In fact, if there's no Nord Stream 2, European households and industry would pay billions more per year for this essential commodity.
We also asked the Nord Stream project as to whether they thought the US sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline were legal, or whether this was in fact a breach of international law.
We also recall that the European Commission has described such sanctions as a breach of international law. The EU does not recognize the extraterritorial application of US sanctions, which it considers to be contrary to international law. Furthermore, EU policies and practices should not be determined by the threat or imposition of third country sanctions. As a principle, the EU opposes the imposition of sanctions against EU companies conducting legitimate business in accordance with EU law.
It seems that the Nord Stream's point of view is very much in line with those of the likes of Angela Merkel, and hence raises the question as to whether the US are once again acting illegally when it comes to blocking the notion of free trade.
There's more to just the military and political rivalry between Russia and the U.S. And in a trade similar to the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it seems that Europe is once again the battleground for these two global superpowers. There's no doubt that energy wars are a very real thing. And as the world slowly moves away from high carbon emitting fuels, the race is on to be the main global supplier of newer and cleaner forms of energy. And in this case, liquefied natural gas is the commodity of choice. But as with any choice, it is ultimately the consumer who must decide what they want and from whom they want to buy it. As at the end of the day, the final decision will ultimately come down to price, a war in which Russia is clearly winning in this aspect. Don't forget, we want to hear about the stories that matter to you, so join us on our Twitter page @AD_program and drop us a message. Furthermore, log on to our website to watch this show and all of our previous episodes, all of which are available 24 hours a day. That's all the time we have for this week. I've been Kavatak Boye. On behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time.